Okay, thank you for the invitation to this nice conference with I think, a very important theme, the idea of the changing role of media, or what role does media play in American society. And I'm going to talk about the rise of opinion journalism and where it came from and why it's a little bit different now than it was maybe in past years. And that's an important issue which I hope to deal with in the paper that I plan to write later on this topic. If we talk about the history of journalism, it served a very important role in American history because it was sort of a referee or a mediator between government and the public. A lot of the early journalism served a public interest in that it uncovered issues that weren't being addressed by politicians. Things like Sinclair's famous novel, The Jungle, about the Chicago meatpacking plants and the unsanitary aspects of them, to say the least, or Ida Tarbell, who wrote for McClure's magazine a serial expose on John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. And journalism in these days was really important because the society was only partially literate. There wasn't obviously technical or communications in the modern sense, no radio, obviously no television, no internet. So the journalist was a public servant in a way, usually in an investigative aspect to try to improve society. That started to change a little bit, and I'm going to talk more in the modern sense during the Cold War, when opinion journalism was actually much more important than simply stating opinions. In fact, probably the most famous opinion journalist was Walter Lippmann, who actually coined the term the Cold War in the late 1940s to describe this sort of nebulous competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And I think at that time, opinion journalists or columnists, whether they be in New York or Washington, were far more important than some of the minor officials or public officials that they were covering. If you want to talk about journalists like Scotty Reston or the Alsop brothers, who were working in Washington, they were almost as much involved in policy making than some of the officials they were covering. The famous Georgetown gossip scene was famous for leaks, and if a politician or a president, whether it was Eisenhower or Kennedy or Johnson, wanted to get something out without doing it officially and publicly, he would leak it to an influential columnist in a Georgetown cocktail party, and it would mysteriously become public. In fact, Joseph Alsop was famous for advising John Kennedy to pick Lyndon Johnson as his vice presidential candidate, running mate in 1960. So these opinion journalists were more than just journalists. They were actually sort of on this quasi opinion leader, but also opinion shapers. So that's where I want to take this into the modern era, into the 1970s and Watergate, where journalism played a role in actually toppling a president, Richard Nixon. And later in the post-Watergate era, journalism sort of became part of the popular culture. And in fact, I think that's one of the places I want to take this, is when the 1970s and into the 1980s, the idea that Woodward and Bernstein were more than just journalists. They became pop culture celebrities. They even made a film, All the President's Men, where they were played by Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford, and Jason Robards played Ben Bradley. And it was a very glamorous idea that these journalists were tackling problems that the public might not otherwise know about. Watergate being the most important, but later into the 1980s, you get a lot of films discussing the role of journalism and how important it is in uncovering issues that people should know about. In fact, when Henry Kissinger wanted to make sure something got public and shaped in a favorable way, he would leak it first to Scott Reston, the famous New York Times foreign affairs columnist. And the next day, or maybe a week later, he would drop that into a column about how this is a wise policy for the United States. So these opinion journalists were really important. And in the same way as Kissinger, the person who took his place in the Carter administration, I wrote a book about Zbigniew Brzezinski. It's a biography, a strategic biography about his role in shaping American foreign policy. And a lot of what he did, and he told me this number of times, is he would use journalists to get something out that he couldn't get out. And a good example of this is when the Soviets looked like they were ready to invade Poland in December of 1980. Brzezinski wanted to leak the consequences of this, what the Soviets would pay if they went into Poland in 1980 like they did in Prague in 1968. And the way he did this is he called up one of his trusted journalistic friends, Karen Elliott House at the Wall Street Journal, and he listed 7 things that the Soviets should think about before they invaded Poland in December of 1980. And the next day, Karen Elliott House had a column in the Wall Street Journal listing these 7 things specifically. So journalism was a way of conducting policy in a way that they couldn't do in a public forum. So that's another interesting way opinion journalism affected public policy. So in the 1970s and moving into the 1980s, journalism became a form of popular entertainment, and some of these political talk shows were small market, or they were in markets, local markets, I should say, maybe like Washington, D.C., Washington Week in Review, or some of these very local shows. Even they might be limited in market because they're on PBS or a very limited audience. But in the mid-1980s, I think there was a turning point where a show on CNN that came on every night at 7:30, I remember this, was called Crossfire, and it was a show about political debate as entertainment. And I actually enjoyed this show, and I think what the formula was that TV executives found out is that whether it's in a drama, dramatic film, or a television show, is that conflict sells. And conflict in the terms of political debate was fairly new to American television. Maybe you had William Buckley on Firing Line on the weekends talking to a guest, but it was actually quite civil. William Buckley was known as this confrontational right-wing editor for the National Review, but if you look at his stuff now on YouTube, it's actually quite civil. And I was looking at it for this particular conference, and I was amazed how civil it was. It was actually really boring in today's expectations of what makes a lively television show. And I think that tells us where we are now, that we have to keep pushing these televised political shows to the point where they become a blood sport, and conflict turns into kind of turmoil, and the more sharper the arguments, the more entertaining it is. And when we get into the late 1980s, the first time I remember thinking why this might actually matter in political terms was the emergence of a political talk show host called Rush Limbaugh, who was recently passed. I'm sure everybody knows Rush Limbaugh, or at least his legacy. But I remember listening to him in the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, and I was a fan of a guy named Tom Snyder, who used to have a radio show on afternoons from 11 to 2 o'clock, and it was very civil radio. He would talk to maybe a guest, that it was a very non-political show. And I remember the day that show got replaced on my local AM radio station by Rush Limbaugh. And when I asked why they did this, I actually just wrote a letter, because I enjoyed Tom Snyder. He kind of relaxed. He was a relaxing guy, and he was a funny guy. And they said Tom Snyder is a national syndicated radio host, but he doesn't move the needle like Rush Limbaugh does. Rush Limbaugh at that time was unknown, and within a year he became the most popular talk show host on American radio. And part of that was that he was divisive. He was based a show on conflict. And I think that's kind of where we are now, in that conflict sells, and therefore you can't really have a civil political chat show or debate show trying to solve problems. There's actually money to be made in creating problems or sustaining problems. And that's one of the issues I want to talk about in this conference. Is journalism solving problems anymore? Like maybe the early days of Sinclair and Tarbell talking about these public issues? Or have we reached a point where television and the internet, or whatever, YouTube, where there is a market in sustaining conflict, perpetuating conflict, never solving conflict, and therefore it's ripping society apart. I think I saw some of that over the last 10 years for sure. But even now in the marketplace, there is this idea that we now are creating our own version of what is political entertainment. Is our politics and do politicians serve us to solve problems, or have we turned the tables to the point now where we're just passive instruments, where we're watching politicians argue with each other for our own entertainment, and therefore we don't have the civic discussion and we don't have solutions to problems. We just have a perpetual problem-making machine, and that is today's American media. In my proposal, I mentioned Joe Rogan is sort of an interesting kind of a aberration in this respect, where he was a guy who just had no background really in professional journalism, but he started what was then a little-known idea called a podcast, and his skill was his variety of guests and the fact that he didn't have a polished editor or a polished cameraman. In fact, that was the whole idea, was that he would imbibe various chemicals sometimes, or just have a beer with his guest and talk for 3 hours, almost like they were in a college dorm room. And in fact, that's probably where he got the idea, is that television shows are always so boring because everybody's so stiff and they don't want to loosen up. And the idea is, if you talk for somebody for 3 hours, it's hard, everything's got to come out. And that was the magic of Joe Rogan's podcast. It would go for 3 hours or 3 hours and 21 minutes. There was no time limit because there was no commercial breaks. And sometimes that was very entertaining. In fact, a lot of times people found it refreshing because they wouldn't listen to somebody talk for 3 hours that's completely on the defensive. But if somebody's relaxed and they might say something a little bit unusual or a little bit interesting, that drove Joe Rogan's ratings up to the point where he had more views than anybody on YouTube, and he didn't really even have a formula. It was a very experimental idea. Just get the guests, welcome, and then just start talking. And Joe Rogan also had the advantage where he didn't really have a boss. He was his own boss. Now, some of that is starting to change because most of you know Joe Rogan went over to Spotify, and this is where I want to end it here. There is this idea that there is a sort of a self-censorship when you go and you attach yourself to a larger entity, of a formula or a carrier that requires you to sort of withhold some of your ideas. And I think we're at that point now with Joe Rogan and opinion journalism, that maybe he doesn't have as much free reign as he used to, and his ratings are lower or his viewerships are down. So that's where I want to take it. Opinion journalism, I think it is entertaining. It is and has historically served a purpose to this society, but I think we're at the point now we're at risk of tearing ourselves apart as a society with this idea of making conflict part of our entertainment culture rather than a political culture that solves problems. Okay, I'm going to end it here. Thanks again for the invitation. Wish everybody well, and we'll see you guys in a few weeks. Okay, thank you.